Good morning. I'm happy to see all of you, but I just saw that we have a visitor here from far, far, far away. And I'll talk more about Victoria later. I'll wait till the sermon. We'll just talk in front of everybody about a good friend. I'm glad that you're here. I apologize for being a few minutes late. Couldn't find my notes in this big old folder that I've got, but I'm excited about our discussion that we get to continue having. Does anybody want to go back to last week and play more of the trolley game? No, we did not enjoy the trolley game most of the time. Nobody likes playing the trolley game. I understand that. But it's an interesting way to get us thinking about life and death. I did want to bring up one thing. Sherry reminded me or pointed out to me later that I didn't know this, but Andy worked for the railroad company for a long time, and he was one of those ones raising his hand saying, I'm not flipping that switch for nothing because that's against the law and you're going to go to jail. And he's not kidding around. He says that is not... that's an easy answer to that question. That's not your switch. You don't touch it. Kind of like the thermostat at your house if you're not supposed to touch that either. A federal offense. I don't want to go to federal penitentiary. So, the question is, the thought process is, do you risk going to jail if you're trying to save a bunch of people's lives? And that's an interesting question.
Well, I'm glad that Andy agreed with me.
That's right. You and Andy are on the same page. So. There's a first time for everything. That's pretty good. I will rephrase this. The original trolley problem was even more complicated. I can't remember if I ended class last week with this or not. I actually changed it to pulling a switch, because to me pulling a switch is a lot easier decision than what the original trolley problem says. The original trolley problem says that you're standing on that bridge and you see the train coming and people are going to be there. There's 5 people on the train tracks and they cannot move out of the way. And next to you is an extremely overweight person. And you can push that person off of the bridge onto the train tracks, and it will stop the train without harming anyone else except the person, and it would save those 5 lives. And then the question is, how many of you are going to push that person off the edge? Do we want to even bother show of hands of how many? Very few of us. So when it's pulling a lever and diverting to another track, okay, we might think about that. But if it comes down to actually pushing somebody off of the bridge in order to stop that train, that changes the dynamics a little bit. And that gets into the discussion about passive action versus passive versus active, involvement. Would I be willing to stand back and do nothing and allow an outcome to happen, versus would I be willing to actually get involved and do something physically to enact, to push someone off the edge of that bridge? Rogers.
A person extremely overweight compared to an elephant is skinny.
Well, that's true. That's right. If you could push an elephant off the bridge, that would be an easier decision. But I don't think we have an elephant nearby, so we have to make up an interesting decision. The what? What's the lion problem? That's true. That's right. I don't have to be faster than the lion. I just have to be faster than you. That's it. You start looking around on the bridge. If you're the fattest person on the bridge, guess what? I got to jump. I got to jump. Anyway, that's what the point of that exercise is to do, is to make us start thinking about how we look at human life, how we value it, and things like that. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, because just in the past week, I've seen 3 or 4 articles that have talked about how we view life and the decisions that are a result of that. In fact, what did New York just do last week? All right, many of us are familiar with, heard it on the news, read it in the paper, saw it on Facebook. They lit up the 3 or 4 tallest, most prominent buildings in New York City pink to signify the celebration of Governor Cuomo signing into law a bill that would allow abortion up to the day of delivery. Up to the day of delivery, they can perform an abortion on a child. Well, and then there's the question is, okay, so if the baby's due at 3 p.m., if the baby's scheduled for a C-section at 3 p.m. on Friday, can you abort the baby at 2:30 and it's not born, so it's okay to perform that abortion, versus if 3:01, right after that baby comes out, well, now, you can't do that. And, of course, we have evidence from Planned Parenthood investigations and things like that. There have been abortion doctors who have delivered live babies and then killed them. And there has been, evidence of that. And so we are disturbed by that. We're disturbed by that. But the question is, why? Why does that disturb us so much? Murder, all right, seems plain and simple to us. Have you ever had a discussion with someone who was pro-abortion? Have you ever personally had an in-depth conversation with someone who was pro-abortion? Rogers? Okay. At the clinic, you'll definitely come in contact with people who come from a very different background, a very different understanding of the world than what we have. And so the question becomes, why are they so fiercely advocating for a woman's right to do this when she feels that is necessary? We're going to talk about that a little bit more, and about the viewpoint that about this issue that comes about. But that's just one example. There were 2 articles in the past week about some work that Chinese geneticists have done recently. I don't know if you saw this or not, but one article is about monkeys. They have figured out a way to genetically clone monkeys so that they can perform experiments on them. And the intention in this case, of course, we've been cloning animals since Dolly 25 years ago. That was the sheep back when I was in college. So this is not a new issue, but in China there's a new kind of wrinkle to it. They're intentionally cloning these monkeys with diseases. They're intentionally cloning them to have genetic problems so that they can try to tinker with them. And of course, the stated intention is that they want to figure out how to eradicate these genetic problems, and so they're creating these clones so that they can do that, and then moving on. But there was another Chinese geneticist in the past week, maybe 2 weeks. I believe, if I read the article correctly, he has been executed by the Chinese government. I believe that the last time I heard, that was what had been speculated. Of course, China's not very upfront about what they do to their citizens very often. Their view of human life is, questionable anyway. But this other geneticist that I'm speaking about, genetically altered embryos and created genetically altered humans. Twins, created and that's pretty typical when you're doing genetic modifications, is to try to create twins or triplets. A lot of times in women who are couples who are dealing with infertility and they get fertility treatments, they'll wind up having twins or triplets or more, because you implant as many eggs as you can and just hope that they come to full development. And so he had tinkered with these babies. And so the questions come up. Apparently, he got in a lot of trouble. And like I said, the last time I heard, the government had kind of secretly taken him away, and we'll probably never see him again. But the intention is, hey, if you get pregnant somewhere down the road, you may be able to go to your doctor, have a little procedure done, and change that girl to a boy before you get 3 or 4 months into the pregnancy. Which in China would be a big deal, because overpopulation problems that they had for a number of years said, you could only have 2 children, and you were only allowed to have a certain number of one sex or the other. And so female children for a long time in China were not welcome in the home. They were not viewed as good. Many of them were given up immediately after birth, or other kinds of problems like that, because they weren't seen as helpful or valuable to society. So if you found out you were going to have a girl, you just go have a little procedure, have a boy. That baby was going to have blue eyes. You wanted it to have brown eyes, you could go in, tinker around a little bit, get a baby with brown eyes. Going to have a baby that's got an IQ of 100. which is okay. But you want a baby with an IQ of 50. Play around a little bit. Next thing you know, you got a baby with an IQ of 150. It's like Lego blocks. And we pick and choose, and we get to decide some things. Now, there are some benefits to this already. There's procedures that can be done to find out if a child's going to have a life-threatening disease before it's born. And once they figure out that that baby has those problems, they can go in and do surgical procedures inside the womb and save that baby's life. So not everything that we're talking about doing is unacceptable. We got to figure out where that line is. What is okay to do and what is not okay to do. Of course, the same tests have been used. I cannot remember, so I won't say which country it might have been. But there is a country in Europe that has eliminated the Down syndrome population in their country. They don't have to worry about people with Down syndrome anymore because they do the test on pregnant women, and when they find out that that baby in the womb has the markings of Down syndrome, well, they abort it. They kill the baby, and so they don't have any more children being born with Down syndrome. So here's the questions. If you go in and you find out that your child has some sort of problem or there's the potential for some sort of issue, what are you going to do? You know, we have all of these questions, and we're going to spend a couple of weeks kind of digging into where we get the ideas that we get and why we think the ways that we think, and can we speak intelligently to other people about that when they don't understand, while we get upset about some things that upset us. Right. Nobody's making any problems. Right. And that, you know, if you didn't hear, or for those who are watching maybe the streaming online, you know, we go to war against a country like Germany for their elimination or attempted elimination of an entire population, the Jewish population. And it's not just the Jewish population. They wanted to create the perfect race, and so if you were handicapped in some way, shape, form, or fashion, they took people in wheelchairs and rolled them up to cliffs and tipped the wheelchair over. It's just a lot easier. It's a lot better on society if we just don't have those people who are just going to drag us down and hold us back. And because the Jews were inferior by genetics, it was okay to do that to them too. Of course, we had the Olympics. Was it the 34 Olympics? Jesse Owens, 36 perhaps, something like that. He wins those races. They're held in Germany. The gold medal winner traditionally is supposed to be able to go and meet the ruler, the monarch, the president, the chancellor, whatever, an official ceremony. You're supposed to get to come through and shake his hand. And of course, Hitler wasn't having any of that. He was quite certain that his perfect Aryan, athletes were going to put these African Americans in their place, and that didn't happen. But he wouldn't acknowledge them, wouldn't shake hands. So it's not just a Jewish thing, but it's anything that was inferior, is something that we're thinking about here. And then, what Brother Lewis says is we fight against that. 6 million people being executed, that's unacceptable. But 60 million people have been killed by abortion since 1973, Roe versus Wade, which I believe was passed into law in January. This is, I think January is the month that's celebrated. In fact, I think the New York law was signed into law on the day of Roe versus Wade. So whatever day last week that was the actual day.
Yeah, I'm talking about science and what's happening. That years ago with the clinic, the couple had a baby, had orange positive blood. The doctors could have changed that blood to orange negative.
Right.
Save that baby's life. But the mother lady said, no, it's feeding them through the vein, and you can't eat blood. And so they did not exchange that baby's blood. So the baby died.
They had an understanding from Acts chapter 15 about not eating blood, that you couldn't get a transfusion kind of thing.
Just a transfusion. They said, no, that's like feeding blood. And they did not let that baby's blood
So we have, and there are groups, I'm not going to, you can go out and do the research and find out which groups these are that reject medical technology like that to varying degrees. There's groups that are so extreme that you can't go to the doctor at all, take any medicine at all, because the Bible says if you're sick, pray. And if God wants you to get better, then He'll get you better. Doesn't matter that God created the resources for us to have medicines and the knowledge to have doctors and everything like that. But they're using a biblical understanding. So some people look at us and say, well, you guys are using a biblical understanding, and it's just as crazy as those people. Those people that don't vaccinate their children. Those people that look at, you've got this backwards view of the Bible, and because of your backwards view of the Bible, you're going out making these horrible choices and forcing your way of thinking on other people, and it's not right and it's not fair. So we have to be able to explain where we're coming from. We have to be able to explain and articulate what's going on so that we can know for sure where we stand and help other people understand that as well. Right.
And they have been in the majority ever since we came to this country.
Had the opportunities.
We still got laws like that.
Right.
We still got judges ruling like that. It's just idiocy.
If we claim to be Christians, that should influence the decisions that we make. You can't separate, as much as we might talk about it, it's hard to separate what your faith is and what kind of decisions you're going to make, for instance, in the political arena or in the job or anything like that. That's what our ethics class is about. We don't just go around making decisions willy-nilly. We make them based on our faith. So if people are walking around claiming to be Christians and making these decisions, we need to be able to address that and say, here's why we should think about things differently. Abortion's a hot topic right now. We got a lot of issues specifically that we can dig into, but first we've got to understand the general principles. All right, there has to be this foundation, first of all, that we build all of these thoughts off of, because once we have this foundation, it influences all kinds of decisions at the beginning of life and at the end of life, for instance. What kind of things we do with an unborn child, what kind of medical procedures we perform, what kind of birth control we do or don't use, what we think about, tampering with, the health or the genetics or anything of that child, what we do when that baby is born, how we take care of that child, what we do with it. And then at the end of life, we have the same kinds of issues. They just come up in different questions. Feeding tubes and resuscitation, ventilators and extraordinary measures, assisted suicide, what to do in difficult situations like that. Quality of life versus quantity of life, et cetera, et cetera. So I got some things for us to look at, some things for us to consider. And it's best if we go back to the beginning. So we'll just turn to Genesis chapter 1. This probably won't be new information for most of you. When I taught this class, when I went through these subjects, for instance, in the teenage class, we went into a lot more detail about some of this stuff because it might have been the first time for some of these younger people to hear this. And we need to build that foundation. But this is just reminding us of this foundation that we have. Or someone who doesn't mind reading loud for us, Genesis chapter 1, what does it tell us in verses 26 and 27?
You want me to read the NIV?
That's fine.
Verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.
And in 27?
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
The reason we fight so hard about Genesis and whether or not it's accurate accurate and whether or not it's believable and reliable, or if it's just a bunch of fairy tales that people tell, is because Genesis chapters 1 and 2, right off the bat, spell out an awful lot of the foundations of what we believe. In Genesis chapter 1 by itself, we get the origin of the whole entire universe. In Genesis chapter 1 by itself, we get the existence of, or at least the hint of the existence of the Trinity within the one God. Let us, for instance. We have the power of God. We have all of these kind of things that are given to us explicitly or implicitly right in the first page of the Bible that we read. It becomes crucial to our understanding of Scripture and to our understanding of the world around us. And it begins with God and then very quickly gets to God's creation of man. And we need verses 26 and 27 because it tells us some things about people. What are some of the things that we learn about people just from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27?
We learned that God did not look like a monkey. Because if that's the case, we look like monkeys, so we're creating God's image.
We are created in God's image. Right off the bat, we have a description about our purpose, our existence. It did not seem to be something that was an afterthought, and it did not seem to be something that was based on the blueprints of some other animal or creation. God used a lot of copy and paste, if you let me use that, language, in creating the world. There's a lot of repetition in forms and in patterns and in things that work. And of course, my understanding is that the reason is because if something ain't broke, what? There's no need to fix it, right? So we keep doing things that work. That's why we share over 50% of our DNA with bananas, because if the DNA works, there's no need to tinker around with it too much. But a lot of similarities that some people say was just proof that we all evolved from the same thing. Well, you don't necessarily have to believe that. And Genesis 1:26 says that God didn't take a primate and then use it to shape a human being. In fact, later on in Genesis chapter 1, what does it say God did to create us? Did he take a monkey and transform it? No. Dust to the ground, right? Dust to the ground. Remember, just think about me. Anytime you wonder about that. Adam means dirt. I still can't get over that, but the reason his name is Adam is because he was made from the dust of the ground, right? So Adam means dirt. So, man, mud. My name is Mud. That's right. That's right. We could go too many different directions with that, so we're going to move on. But the point is that God had an intention and a purpose for creating us, and the design that he used was not any kind of other animal or creation. In fact, we are distinctly different from them because after Adam names all the animals, it says explicitly that there was none found like him. He was alone in that moment. And that's when God created woman. The intelligence to be separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. You look at groups out there that argue we're no different. We are animals exactly like and completely equal to every other animal that walks or swims or flies. And their perspective on that is based on their worldview. We have to have a worldview that's different, that can point out God did make all of us like he made all of them, but there's something different about us. Now, going back to what Rogers said, God doesn't look like a monkey because it says we're made in God's image. So what does God look like then? God doesn't look like anything. God doesn't have a body. When Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 says, let us make man in our image, the Latin is imagio Deo. The image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Is that talking about how many fingers God has on his hand? It's talking about how many eyes he has or what shape his nose is? God doesn't have a body. God is spirit. So what does it mean to say that we're made in the image of God if God doesn't have a form at all? The characteristics of God. It is funny how, as a person, he did have 2 legs and 2 eyes, and he walked upright and didn't drag his knuckles on the ground. That's true. That's exactly right. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. He took on human form. The likeness of man. So God made us like him in Genesis chapter 1, and then when it was time to redeem mankind, Christ became like us to be able to redeem us as both God and man. So there's a whole list of parallels that we can talk about there that are fascinating. But Genesis chapter 1 is giving us this idea that we're created in the image of God. We have these attributes or these characteristics, and we've talked about this a little bit before. You know, basically the job that God does in creating the universe, after he completes that job, he passes its responsibility off to us. The same types of things that God does in creating and sustaining and multiplying all the earth, at the conclusion of it, he looks at Adam and Eve and says, now, you guys have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and the beasts that crawl, and you be fruitful and create. You go out and multiply, you populate, and you work and take care of this thing that I've done, this place that I've made. So God gives us characteristics and attributes like him, love, compassion, and we could go on and on. He also gives us the same tasks that he had, obviously limited in power and ability. We can't create the way God creates, but we've been given the same task because we're made in the image of God. We are the stewards of his creation because we carry out those same types of things. And so, again, we can pull so many different things out of here. Are animals as valuable then as people are? Are animals, if we are created in the image of God and they are not, is there a difference between us and them? I think most of us would say yes, there's a difference between us and them. We are of a higher order. We have a higher creation. We have a higher value than they do. What do we possess that the animals do not possess, that we read about right here in Genesis chapter 1? A soul. And as far as I understand it, where does that soul come from? Where does that soul, where is the passage, what is the phrase in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 where it shows us where we get a soul and the animals didn't? After God formed man from the dust of the ground, what does it say he then did? And then God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Now that's not CPR, okay? That is some animation, that is some life-giving essence of God that the rest of creation didn't get, as far as I can understand. It does say later on in the Old Testament that the animals do have a breath of life in them, but there's nowhere described that God breathed into them the way that he breathed into us. So there is a distinct difference between humans who have the breath of God and the image of God in their being and all the other animals that walk around the earth. Part of that is the intelligence that sets us apart. Part of that is the self-awareness that we have that animals don't have. There's intelligence in the animal kingdom. I'm not denying that. I love how smart your pets are. My pets are not very smart. But your pets might be very smart. You can train them and teach them and they can learn, but they don't have a self-consciousness. Your dog never goes up to the full-length mirror in front of your closet and looks at itself and says, what am I exactly? Never sits there and tries to figure out the purpose of its life. A dog just goes about business and squirrel. That's just what dogs do. Caught up in the moment. They can be taught to hold back. They can be taught not to react on instinct, but even then, they're not reacting based on an intelligence that says it's not a good idea for me to do that because that would be morally inappropriate. They're basing that decision on the fact you have trained them that if they obey and not react on instinct in that situation, they'll get a treat. They'll be rewarded. So we have to be different than that, by the way. We have to do more than just react based on instinct and what we, reward and punishment. They were supposed to be higher than that.
Me and Joanne got on the elevator in New York City.
This is not a true story, anybody. I'm just telling you right now. I don't know what's coming next, but it's going to be good.
One woman had a little dog in her arm. She said, he don't know he's a dog. I said, ma'am, take that dog to psychiatrist. Because he's going to wake up some morning and saying, well, if I'm not a dog, why am I barking?
Why am I barking? There you go. Lessons to be learned. That's good. No. It does do something to my train of thought, though. I feel like you just pushed a fat man off a bridge. I got to get it back. No. What we're learning from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, is that man is created in God's image, God's attributes. It has value. And because of that, anything that meets those qualifications of being made in the image of God should be treated as a human being. Do you see what I'm saying? Does it matter how good looking that thing is as to whether or not you should treat it like a human being or not? Do you have to have a certain level of beauty or good looks in order to be considered human? I certainly hope not. We're getting into value. Okay, this is taking us deep into how we look at one another. Not just, we're looking at what does it take to be a person? A person has 2 arms and 2 legs. We look around, we see that. But what about somebody that's born with a deformity and they don't have all of those limbs? Are they not a person? Of course they're still a person. Because personhood is not defined by how many arms or legs you have. How smart do you have to be considered a human being? What does your IQ level need to be in order to be an actual human being? Does it have to be a certain level? Because then what do you do with someone who's had a stroke or something? They're in a vegetative state. They're hooked up to machines, and all of a sudden, are they not a person anymore because they can't talk or they can't interact the way that you can? Go back to the Germany example. What color skin do you have to have in order to be an actual person, a full-fledged person? What color does your skin need to be? Any color.
And that body houses the Holy Spirit. And we don't want to do anything to destroy that body.
The temple is just the outer shell, right? In fact, Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that these are tents. These are temporary dwellings. And we're actually looking forward to the time when we can get rid of this and take on our fully clothed, full nature, the permanent dwelling later on in heaven. For a long time in our country, if your skin color was different, then you were subhuman. I mean, it was law in the land. That was Rogers.
I've even heard members of the church back in the 40s and 50s talk about certain races that, they got a soul.
They've got a soul, but they're somehow still inferior. We have these questions. Are you full status? Do you have full status as a person if your skin's a different color? There's nowhere in Scripture that it says you're not. What about if you only weigh 3.5 pounds and you've only been alive for 23 weeks inside the womb? Are you a person yet? Yes. And this is getting a little ahead to the specific topic there, but, we talk about genetics and things like that. Every human being has their own specific, unique set of genes. Unless you're an identical twin, then there's some interesting things to talk about there. But, a lot of people who don't have any problem with abortion, part of their argument is if someone had a cancerous growth in their body that was stealing their resources and that was preventing them from being able to do what they wanted to do, you would want them to go to the doctor and have that cancerous growth cut out because it's unhealthy. And their understanding of what's growing inside that womb is that it is another bundle of cells, just like a cancerous lump that needs to be or should be or can be eliminated if it's causing problems, if it's doing something that you don't want it to do. It's just a tumor. The problem with that is that if you do a genetic study, the next day that an egg and a sperm have combined, that zygote, the scientific term there, has a completely new genetic code. And that completely new genetic code will stay with that little bitty bundle of cells until it becomes what we look at when we see people walking around today. It no longer has the genetic code of the mother. It no longer has the genetic code of the father. It is a combination of those two, and it's completely new and unique. So at that point, we have a new entity. We have a living entity, even though it couldn't survive on its own. Viability is something that we talk about. Most places, most of the laws for when an abortion can and cannot be carried out in America today deal with viability. If the baby were delivered now, could it survive or not? Well, viability has changed just in the past 20 years about what we used to be able to, what we used to not be able to do if a child was born at 21, 22 weeks. And we see what happens when somebody like Zion was how old? 27 weeks old. 50 years ago, I don't know that Zion would be with us today. I don't know that we had the resources. So he wouldn't be viable. So back then, don't worry about it. But today, I got hands going up everywhere now. All right? But today, we can push that viability back farther and farther and farther. So just because somebody can't make it on their own, does that mean they're not a human being anymore? No, they still have human status. All right, Jeff?
I'm 55 years old.
You're viable.
Yeah. I was 6 weeks premature and weighed just over 4 pounds.
And that was, I won't say how long ago that was. You said how old you were, yeah. So, what we can and can't do, 6 weeks premature back then was a big deal. You have any idea how long you stayed in like neonatal intensive care or anything?
I don't know, but I was told that my incubator had tinted glass.
Your incubator had to have tinted glass.
That's ugly joke, sorry.
That's for the doctor's sake. Richard had a hand up. I get it. You can rationalize to get anywhere.
So much scientific or intellectual discussion doesn't matter to someone who's rationalizing.
They're going to get where they want to get to based on whatever, they'll use whatever facts they need.
This baby keeps me from being in that pretty good dress, and I'd rather...
It'd be easier to just get rid of it. So it's not a person. It's not a person. Rogers?
We've got two in our family. Joanne was born at 2.5 pounds at home. Her grandmother was wrapped bricks from the fire and blankets, fed her with a nose dropper. 2.5 pounds. 77 years later, she sent us out.
Wow.
Our granddaughter, Madison, 19 years old, weighed 1 pound and 10 ounces, stayed 4 months in neonatal care, and now she works at the new hospital.
Mm-hmm. Right. What we talk about as being viable, that's a part of the issue that we're trying to figure out. All right. Correct. Right. 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 It's a lot harder to talk about it in positive terms if you have that definition, if you have that working understanding. That's exactly right. You can call it whatever you want to call it. And we've done that with life as well. How do you define life? That's really what we're talking about today. How do you define what a person is? And they have been able to define that a person is a human-shaped form that has enough organ and brain development to be viable outside of the womb. And so anything that doesn't fit that criteria isn't a person yet. And so there's no need to protect it. That's why it's not murder if you perform an abortion, because we've used that term and changed the definitions and changed the words around. I get emails from, it's an pro-abortion advocacy group, and they don't call us pro-life because the definition of that word puts us in a favorable light. Because if we're pro-life, then they're not pro-life. So they're pro-abortion and we're anti-abortion, because that's a much easier phrase to paint us in a bad light. And so the wording that we use is very important. Jeff?
When you talk about viability, how long is a full term?
Take a full baby, set it out in the woods, and all right, if it's viable, we'll see you in 3 years when you're ready to go to kindergarten, right? It doesn't work that way. So, how we define these terms is important. How we define what a person is matters. And if we're going to be Christians about it, then if we have people on our hands, we've got to treat them a certain way. That's what our ethics are about. So we're starting with this foundation. It's going to give us the opportunity to bring in a lot of other topics in the next few weeks. So thanks for your listening and paying attention, and we'll let everybody come in now. You can come in.